All right. So for this week, I actually have a special guest, Dr. Jessica Barron. Hello. So as many of you know, I do qualitative research. I conduct oral history, interviews. So quantitative, I wanted to go to an expert on quantitative methods to sort of train us collectively on introduction to quantitative methods. So I want to introduce you to Dr. Jessica Barron, who's going to be presenting for us. Jessica Barron, PhD, is a research scientist, sociologist, demographer, and writer. Dr. Barron's body of research addresses questions concerning how large-scale demographic shifts shape the way we measure, theorize, and understand issues of racial inequality, inclusion, and stratification across the United States. Her diverse and unique methodological training as a qualitative and quantitative sociologist landed her fellowships at top research centers across the country, including Loyola University Chicago Center for Urban Research and Learning, the Texas Census Research and Data Center, and Duke Social Science Research Institute. Dr. Barron has taught at Duke University in addition to working as a consultant, lending her vast amount of knowledge and experience in large-scale data collection and management, program evaluation, and qualitative community research. Barron has worked on projects funded by the National Science Foundation, the Texas Census Research and Data Center, and the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute at Texas A&M University. Dr. Barron's work is featured in The Guardian, the Atlanta Way podcast, and published in academic journals, edited volumes, and a forthcoming book manuscript under contract with NYU Press. Welcome, and thank you for coming and lecturing for us, Dr. Barron.
Well, I'm excited to be here and talk to you guys about introduction to quantitative methods. Quantitative methods can kind of be scary. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people think it's really lots of math and all these looming equations and things like that, and it really isn't as bad as it sounds. And there's a comprehensive way to go about it. So
Great.
I'm going to give you a really brief introduction, and hopefully it sparks your interest, and then you can go on for yourself and kind of explore different avenues within this type of research.
Thank you.
So we have main themes in quantitative methods. So the main themes here are data, data sources, and statistics. So data is really just the information that you're going to collect, and you do that with qualitative work, but the difference is the data sources that we use. So instead of doing interviews, ethnographies, oral histories, that kind of stuff, we use large-scale data sets or create our own data sets or surveys or run experiments. And so with data sets, and we'll talk about this a little bit, but in a little, sorry, excuse me, in a little bit. But the data sets can either be large-scale data sets produced by government agencies, produced by different organizations, or you can actually create your own data set. So you can go out, collect data, and then you can put it in a spreadsheet and upload it into a certain type of statistical software. And then statistics. So statistics are a set of methods for collecting and analyzing data. So it's essentially the art of and the science of learning from data. So statistics really offers us a framework for understanding what exactly we've collected and what does it all mean. So that being said, going to the next slide, what is statistics and why is it important? Now, in doing quantitative data, it's not all about statistics, but statistics is the mode, again, for us to understand what we're doing. So it's the study of the collection, organization, analysis, and interpretation of data. So it provides us with a framework for collecting the data, for designing experiments and observations, and for drawing inferences about populations. And we say inferences because statistics isn't necessarily um, traditional math. So it's not always 1 plus 1 equals 2. Statistics provides us with a way to talk about human behavior that can be generalized to the larger public. So if you think about it, because we are using actual people, right? We're not using numbers, we're not using kind of biology, we're using people. People change all the time, and so it's important to have a vehicle for us to talk about people's patterns and behaviors without completely narrowing them down to one thing. So not all people do something 100% of the time, but we can say 95% of the time, or it's statistically significant, meaning that the majority of the population will probably and most likely engage in this type of behavior or this pattern over time. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But that's why we say drawing inferences versus saying this is a hard and true fact. Because again, we're studying people here and people change all the time. So in the short story, statistics is the science of using data to prove a point. So if you want to understand something a little bit better, you use statistics to talk about an overall pattern. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So the overarching topics that we're going to discuss briefly here are describing data, gathering data, and inferring data. So describing data using graphs and numbers, gathering data, different ways to get the data and what it's going to look like, and then inferring data, understanding exactly what we have here. So we're going to go through that. Also, a little tip in point, data is plural, so most likely you're never going to use a sentence that says this data. You say these data. Just a little tip, because sometimes people get really upset if you're ever at a conference and you say this data, they might correct you.
Okay, thank you.
Just want to help. So some of the definitions when you're describing data, you actually need to know what exactly it is that you're describing. So with data, it's a population, right? So an entire collection of individuals or objects, which information that you want to know about. So you can pick people, you can pick different programs at school. Those are all data. Those are all populations that you can draw from. So within the population, there's a sample, a subset of the population selected for some particular reason, right? So if you wanted to understand um, student athletes, right? So you take a subsample of students from different types of sports, and then you can understand their different types of behavior. So that's a subset of the larger population of student athletes. So a variable is a characteristic or property of an individual or unit of analysis. So that being said, say I wanted to understand how much time each student athlete spends on practice. How much time do they spend on homework? That is a variable. So time spent playing sports, time spent playing or doing their homework, those are all variables. Things that I'm trying to find out about the population, things of interest to me. Or say for library science, I'm trying to understand how many are men, how many are women, how many in the program came from a family who had gone to college, how many are first generation. Those are all variables. Gender is a variable. Uh, First generation status, that's a variable. So variables are different things that you want to understand, different characteristics about the population. And then one thing that sets us apart, quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers, is the idea of a representative sample. So this is a part of the target population that exhibits characteristics that you find in the larger population. So a lot of times with qualitative data, you're doing just a handful of people, or you might interview maybe 50 people, but in the larger population, that's not really representative. So, for example, again, if I am trying to understand all of the students at the University of Florida, and I want to understand across all the students how many students, how much time students on average spend doing their homework. However, if I only sample the students in the Honor Society, that is going to look very different than if I sampled students from every single year, from every single major, and across the entire university. If I only picked engineering students, their numbers are going to be very different, and that's not representative. So a representative sample is, if you're going to take, you can't obviously ask everybody in the population. So you want to figure out the characteristics of the population and then pick people who are representative of those particular characteristics. So next slide. So when you describe the data, you want to describe the variables, so you identify the variables. So I have some listed here: race, educational status, marital status, literacy level. It could be whatever you're interested in the project, whatever characteristics you want to know about, those are your variables. And then you have what we call a distribution, so the proportion of individuals in each value. So distribution is easy to remember if you remember old school math with the mean, the median, and the mode. So the mean is the average, the median is right dead in the middle of the values that you have, and the mode is how often they occur. So in the distribution, we like to have what we call a bell curve. So if you can see the image right below, it looks like a bell and it has all those lines. So usually in a normal distribution, if you've set up your sample properly, you're going to have the majority of your values in the middle. Then you're going to have it tear off in kind of a nice mathematical way, which we know people aren't nice and mathematical, so it's not always going to look like a proper distribution, but that's what we're hoping for. Now, if you decide, let's say you want to understand how many students are bilingual across the nation, right? You're probably going to have like a normal curve if you have a representative sample. But say you only chose to study students in the sample from Los Angeles, from Houston, Texas, and from, let's say, San Francisco. The majority of students there are going to be bilingual most likely, and so your bell curve isn't going to look like a nice little curve. It's to one side or the other, meaning the frequency, so the mode, how many times that's occurring, it's happening a lot faster. It's happening more in, let's say, Los Angeles than Kentucky, meaning more students are going to be bilingual in Los Angeles than they are in Kentucky. And so you're not going to have a normal distribution. So again, it is imperative that you get a representative sample. Otherwise, your information is going to be biased and skewed to one side. You're not going to have that nice little bell. And so, again, when you're describing the data, you're going to describe the variables, you're going to describe the distribution, if it's skewed or not, if it's a normal distribution, if the population is functioning kind of normally, or if there's something interesting that's pulling it from one side to the other. And then summarizing the data. You can do this through graphs, as you probably all have seen lots of graphs and charts in quantitative information. That's really how we show what's happening. It's important to show graphically because you want people to be able to see and understand the trends that you're talking about. And then you also can talk about it numerically. If you've ever seen a quantitative article, there's usually a table with a bunch of numbers in each panel. And all those numbers mean something different. And so those numbers help us to associate the relationship between variables, meaning, let's say we're trying to understand preparedness for college. And so some of the variables are family income, how many of your parents went to college, if any. So let's say you had a variable of you had the student and then you had parents' income. And so the higher the parents' income, the more likely they are to be prepared for college. And so you're going to see that in a graph, you're going to see a relationship that's going up. And so that's important to talk about. So those numbers that we have on those tables, sometimes it's helpful to have a graph associated because sometimes just staring at a bunch of numbers can give us a headache. So it's really important that you also have a graph to associate with those numbers in those tables. And then lastly, you'll have statistical software, which will help you create those graphs and help you understand those numbers. So real quickly, when you are describing the data, you're essentially describing different populations, or what we call units of analysis. So within within quantitative studies, you can literally study anything. So the units of analysis are usually individuals, people, places, groups, institutions, nations, programs. So anything that you pretty much want to study, any population, is up for grabs. So because you do study human subjects, we do have something called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. Every university has one, and they just make sure that you're ethically going about the types of research that you're going to do. And sometimes populations are what we call vulnerable populations, so the homeless or um, those who are incarcerated, pregnant women, those are what we call vulnerable populations, and there are different types of measures and procedures you have to go through in order to study them. However, in general, there's virtually no community that you cannot study in some way, shape, or form. And we call them, in quantitative study, units of analysis. So people will ask you, oh, what was your unit of analysis? And you'd say, oh, kindergartners in Texas. Or what's your unit of analysis? I studied all biology majors across the United States. And those are different types of units of analysis. So the second part, gathering the data. So in order to gather data quantitatively, typically we use what we call available data or secondhand data, which are large-scale data sets. I've listed 3 here. There's literally hundreds of data sets that you can look towards and help you kind of decipher what types of information you want. because I study residential segregation, I use the census because the U.S. Census is the only data set actually that accounts for everybody in the U.S. population, but it also has neighborhoods and city information, so I can tell where somebody lives in association to someone else, and what their segregation score is. Are they isolated from other groups? Are they integrated with other groups? And what that might mean for access to, let's say, education, healthcare, those types of things. And so that's the kind of work that I engage in. Ad health data is a great data set. It actually has what we call waves, 4 waves. So it's longitudinal, meaning it started with one wave, and so everybody in that survey, they then did 4 panels, 4 waves, meaning they took all the respondents from that first wave and interviewed them again in 4 years, interviewed them again in 4 years, all the way from the time that they were 12 to the time that they were 34 years old. And so we have this long, what we call longitudinal data over time, and it has hundreds and hundreds of variables. So it's really interesting, and you might want to look into that data set. It has everything from skin tone to literacy to where people live to the languages they speak, all kinds of interesting variables that could really help you understand certain patterns that you're interested in, right? So there's also, so we have secondary data, we have firsthand data, which is you collecting the data. And some quantitative sociologists, which is my field, they find that some of these data sets aren't really the data that they want. And so they end up getting grants and creating their own data set. Now, obviously, you probably won't be doing this right now, but you can go out and maybe take certain observations of different people or different things, behaviors, and then, like I said again, put it in a spreadsheet, and you can actually upload that spreadsheet into Stata or into statistical software, and you have your own data set created, and then you can play around with the variables. You probably will have to take a quantitative class in order to know how to do all that, but it is possible to create your own data set. So then we have experiments, and experiments are interesting because, again, we use people as our unit of analysis. Most likely, people are going to be involved in all the projects that we do, and so because of that, there are ethical and practical things that you need to think about when you do experiments. So experiments basically means you have different groups, but then you put in what we call intervention. An intervention is something slightly different from group to group to give you different types of behaviors so that you can observe. So say, for example, we have 2 groups, and I say, I'm interested in team building and how different groups work together. So the first group, I'll tell them in their instructions, everybody has a skill set that'll be valuable in order to complete this task. Please complete this task in 20 minutes. But in this group, group B, I might say, I need everybody to complete this task. Some will be better than others, but this task needs to be completed in 15 to 20 minutes. Now, and then I watched and observed their behavior. The intervention was the fact that I gave them slightly different instructions. One instruction basically posed everyone as equal. The other instruction posed everybody as kind of in this hierarchy. Some were good, some were not so good. And then we watch how that behavior is changed. So that could be an experiment. Different experiments that didn't go so well that you would probably learn about when you take an ethics course if you are going to do experiments are the syphilis study. So white doctors injected black men with syphilis, not telling them, and then wanted to see how many other people were infected with syphilis throughout their community. So that was a very unethical thing to do, and that happened over time. And we also have what we call the Stanford study, which is in the slide. So a professor took a group of graduate students at Stanford and created some of them as prisoners, other ones as officers, and then reversed the roles. And because the individuals got so wrapped up in the roles and so wrapped up in their identities, they ended up having mental breakdowns, and they actually stopped the project far before it should have ever been finished. And there's actually a documentary about it that you can watch. But when you are doing experiments, because we are people, you need to make sure that if people are participating in your different type of experiment, they're not going to be subjected to any other type of risk than they would have in their normal everyday life. So you want to make sure that you're not changing the intervention so much that these people are actually going through mental, physical, or emotional stress. We don't want that to happen. So lastly, our surveys. And surveys are great to get a pulse of what's happening. Surveys are used all the time. We have survey polls, especially about this election, and you can see those a lot throughout media, social media, in the news. And surveys, again, you can ask people different questions, and here's where the bias comes in. So you want to make sure that you're as unbiased as possible and that you have a proper sampling design. Meaning, if I want to understand the political climate of a university, but I only poll or I only survey the Young Republicans Club on campus, that's going to give me a very biased sample. You can also be biased in the way that you ask the questions on the survey. If I'm asking about the election, who you're going to vote for, I'm not going to say, oh, are you going to vote for stupid Trump or crooked Hillary? I'm not going to say that because that is bias and letting you know where I stand as a researcher on the matter. You want to create a question that says, who will you vote for in this election? And then provide whatever answers. You also have to be clear about the answers that you provide because sometimes that could lead towards bias. Again, if you ask who are you going to vote for in this election, but you only offer Hillary Clinton as an option, that is a biased answer. Or for someone like myself who studies race and ethnicity, it was only until 2000 that we were able to mark more than one box for racial categorization. So we biased the answers towards people who only identified as one race. And that was wrong because then we were missing a whole group of multiracial individuals that really could have mattered for our study, but they were counted out in that question. So you want to be careful with bias and questioning. So lastly, as I get to the next slide, there it goes. We have inferring data. And again, if you remember all the way back to what we were talking about before with statistics and quantitative data, because we study people, there is no 1 plus 1 equals 2. That doesn't happen. But we do have inferences that we can make. We have statistical models that give us a really close algorithm to tell us what behaviors are most likely going to happen or what patterns are most likely going to happen within a population. And so we call that inferring data, drawing conclusions. So the first type of inferring is hypothesis testing. So I know you talked a little bit about hypotheses, but really briefly, whenever you start a study, a quantitative study, you have a hypothesis. So you decide all graduate students will finish their degree in 2 years. That could be your hypothesis, and that's what we call the null hypothesis. And then whatever data set you decide to use, and over time you run different statistical models, and it'll give you an answer at the end, and that answer will help you either what we call reject the null or accept the null. If you reject the null hypothesis, meaning I say, actually, no, not all graduate students will graduate in 2 years, then I rejected the null and I went with the alternative hypothesis, which is basically your finding. The alternative hypothesis is, actually, we found that most students graduate in 3 years, or it depended on your major, or whatever thing you came up with in the variables that you decided to use in your model. So it's important to kind of think through, and you want to be, with your hypothesis, you don't just want it to be like, oh, I think, all people are nice. Like that's a throwaway hypothesis. Actually think about what other literature has said, what problem you're interested in, and make your hypothesis substantial because that is going to be the basis of your study. So secondly, statistical significance. So again, because we study people, we can't always say 100% of the time all librarians are going to do X, Y, and Z. That's just not going to happen. But what we have are different equations within statistical design, in statistical models, that tell us, based on the subpopulation that we have, there's only about a 5% chance that this behavior won't happen within the larger population. So that sounded kind of confusing. But again, to break it down, if we took the larger population, then we took our subset, right, our representative sample, and we decided to look at, like we said, preparedness for college. And whatever numbers that we came out with at the end of the statistical model that we ran, it should be only about 5% of the time this wouldn't happen in the larger population. So about 5% of the time you might see some variation, meaning outliers. You might see some people that might be doing different things, but overall, in general, you're going to see this. And that's the power of quantitative study, is we can say things like, in general, overall, this is statistically significant. These things matter. This is most likely going to be the pattern of this particular population or of this particular study. So this is why, we should have either a policy intervention, or this is why this new program should be started. These are the things that you can say about quantitative studies that you can't necessarily say about qualitative work. That does not mean qualitative work is not important. Qualitative work is imperative in letting us know what is happening on what we call the ground level, the every day-to-day lives of people. So if we know that over, you know, 30% of women and children are in poverty because we did a quantitative study, that matters. And then if you started interviewing women and children who were in poverty, that tells us exactly the day-to-day struggles that they're dealing with. So we can come together as quantitative and qualitative scientists to find some type of policy intervention or something that can help these communities. So both are very much needed. So we also have demographic methods. These are a little bit different than traditional statistical methods. My degree's in sociology and demography, and so we have things called life tables, fertility tables, immigration tables. These things help us march out kind of the patterns and social patterns of a population. Demography is concerned with how populations change over time and what that change does to different structures in society. So, for example, baby boomers. We had this huge boom of babies born after the Second World War, and they were huge in our labor force, but now they are aging at a rate that we don't really have to help and support them, right? So these types of changing demographics are what we need to understand. And there's different methods that go along with those that are a little bit different than traditional quantitative methods. And then lastly, we have statistical software. Like I kept saying, you can run these models. What the heck is a model? A model is basically when you have the variables that you're interested in, so all the different characteristics that you're interested in, and then you have the population. And then we do what we call a regression model, meaning we take whatever our dependent variable is, so it could be, essentially your unit of analysis, so it could be students in their third year of college, and then you want to understand what they eat, how much they make, all these different things. And then you basically what we call regress. You find out the relationship between those two. So our students, is there a relationship between students in their fourth year of grad school and how much they eat or how much they weigh if we're interested in their health? And it could be statistically significant, meaning yes, there is a relationship, or it's not statistically significant, which means you can eat ramen noodles all the way through college and you have, great blood pressure. That could happen, or not. But these are the types of relationships that we're trying to find, and statistical software helps you do that. So it gives a basic value to each of your variables, and then that value, based on your overall population, is run through these models through a specific equation, and then that equation lets us know if this is in fact significant to the question you're asking or if it's not. And so there's Stata, SPSS, SAS, and R. They're virtually all the same. They just, their commands are a little bit different, so it depends on basically who trained you and what software you have access to. But they all do the same thing. And so statistical software is very helpful and almost imperative if you're trying to understand certain types of quantitative patterns. And that is it.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to exit out here so I can ask. All right. Okay, so just a couple of questions for you as a quantitative researcher. What are some of your suggestions for first-time quantitative researchers? A lot of these students might sort of be thrown into running surveys and trying to sort of interpret stats in their libraries.
So there's a couple things. One, I think that it is important to get yourself familiar with the language that you're not sociologists, quantitative methodologists use. And so it's important to read some different journal articles that are quantitatively based that helps you pick up on certain types of things that they're saying. We might say, um, people who eat a lot of sugar have a lot of cavities. But a quantitative sociologist, or excuse me, researcher might say The likelihood that a person who eats a lot of sugar will go, or the likelihood that a person who eats a lot of candy will have, cavities at, a zero point 0.5 statistical significant level.
Hmm.
So we're basically saying the same thing, but there's a few different notches that are different in that sentence. And
Okay.
so that'll help you become very familiar, because it's not that we're completely speaking a different language and that's a language that you can't learn. You could definitely learn that language. It's not something that is completely foreign to you. You actually have these concepts, and statistics is actually fairly intuitive. It's
Hmm.
helping you understand patterns that you've probably seen throughout your life, and now you are seeing how significant they are,
Hmm.
or what things might be helpful to understand the pattern a little bit better. I'd also suggest YouTube is a great tool.
Hmm.
There's different quantitative conferences that happen, and you can actually watch on YouTube a few of the different types of presentations, again, to familiarize yourself with this information, how it's presented, how people talk about it.
Hmm.
And then I know for myself, what really helped is actually policy briefs. A lot
Hmm.
of times, different policies are put in place, and it actually dumbs down the information
Hmm.
very in a short kind of brief. It's supposed to be brief, so it's usually 3 to 5 pages,
Hmm.
and it can really help to sharpen your skills on the language that they're using. Because really, one of the biggest barriers is the language. The biggest barrier is understanding, okay, exactly what they are saying. But then when you realize, oh, they're speaking English just like I do, I
Hmm.
can actually understand what they're saying. That's really helpful. And
Hmm.
then obviously, if there's any workshops that university holds, that is very helpful. Um, and also too, because of the wonderful world of the World Wide Web, you can actually go on different. Um, I think it's, and I can get this information for you, but there's a quantitative community, and they post different types of webinars and different
Hmm.
things, and that is really helpful. And it's free, and it's for
Great.
Brown or UCLA or different schools all across the nation. So those are different tools that I would suggest if you're kind of wanting to dabble in quantitative work.
Great. Thank you. One of the things we talk about a lot in the class is um, how to approach a community where you might be an outsider. So, how do you study communities that might be different from yourself, or how do you proceed? I know you talked a little bit about bias. How do you proceed um, and acknowledge bias as a researcher?
Right. So specifically with quantitative data, sometimes you're not always collecting face-to-face data from individuals.
Hmm.
And so a lot of
Right.
times, because these data sets are, for lack of a better word, they are drawn up by white researchers, there's a lot of pit holes when it comes to marginalized groups. And that could
Hmm.
be marginalized in terms of gender, so not a lot of women were polled.
Hmm.
Um, not a lot of people of color were polled, maybe people from a certain income bracket. So the biggest thing that you have to think about as a researcher are what populations are not represented and why, who's not seated at the table, and
Hmm.
what might their perspective add or change to my project,
Hmm.
and doing your best to make sure the sample that you um, that you select and the questions that you ask are really inclusive to the larger groups that could potentially be outside of your norm. And because, let's say, you are a researcher coming into a community that you are not a part of, you have to really be diligent to do as much background work on that population beforehand, because you could be asking questions that no one even cares about in that community. You think they're
Hmm.
important, but actually, these questions are important. And again, this is the importance of qualitative work, because qualitative work has gone into the field, has gone into these communities, and let us know what's important to the communities. And then, as a quantitative researcher, you take a step back, take those questions and those findings, and then create a larger data set, or pull from a data set things that would be interesting that you may not have thought of prior. There's a really good book called White Logic, White Methods,
Hmm.
and it's a fairly large book, but it goes through different methodological techniques and talks about the ways in which bias has in many ways impaired some of the findings from these techniques that we hold up
Hmm.
as kind of the gold standard, because from their inception they were devised either for a purpose of proving that one group was subpar to the other,
Hmm.
or they were devised by a group who was the majority and the minority group wasn't ever thought of, or has a completely different narrative or completely different approach to these problems, and then it was never quite theme because we didn't have the methods to do so.
Interesting.
And then the last thing with bias is there's a term and a technique we call overrepresentation. So if I know that in this sample that was selected or in this survey that was created that was, secondhand, meaning someone else did it or a large government entity did it, and I want to make sure that that there's an overrepresentation of, let's say, the black population. If they're going the U.S. population overall, we know the U.S. population isn't cut nicely into there's 10% of this, 10% of that, 10% of that. So instead of having 10% of each group, because that won't be accurate, maybe I'll have 30% of one group, 50% of one group, and 10% of one group, and that would actually map out the entire population. Right. So we do something called overrepresentation, where we try to overrepresent certain groups who have been underrepresented in society or in the actual survey or in the actual data set. And a lot of data sets have done that already because they understand that has been a problem. So some of them self-correct for underrepresentation already.
Great.